All right, so maybe that's kind of a feel a little bit for some jazz theory, but I think that we should do one more thing. We've talked mostly about chords and now analyzing chord structure a little bit. We haven't really talked about very much about scales, and I want to be sure we've talked enough about scales as well
Okay.
um, while we're talking about theory. And you know what? I actually have this structured in my mind. So there are only four classes of scales, four categories of scales. And the first category are all the scales that come out of the major scale. In other words, they're all derivatives of the major scale. Therefore, we're talking about Dorian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Lydian, Aeolian, Locrian. Those are all scales that are just the major scale, starting in a different place. They're different modes of the major scale. So you've got a lot of stuff covered just if you know the modes of the major scale. But now it's what's really interesting is if you change one note in the major scale. So let's flat to three.
Mhm.
Now we're looking at a melodic minor scale. Let's revisit the modes.
Okay.
So with that one note changed, the first mode, of course, is melodic minor. This is going to be very useful if you have a minor chord functioning as a tonic. The second mode is frankly not usable. Um, some books have tried to justify it and call it a Dorian flat nine. There's a reason that never happens. It sounds wretched. It's a terrible. It never happens. Why would you try to justify a theory based on it then? And Dan Hurley, Dan's a good friend of mine, pianist, jazz pianist, and a bright guy. But he published a scale thing, a book, and he called it that, the Dorian flat nine. I was like, Dan, show me an example of when that ever happens. It never happens. And there's all you got to do is play it on the piano and you'll realize why it never happens. So the second mode is not useful. Look at the third mode. Now, to be able to analyze these modes and what they're doing, you know what? I didn't lay a foundation for this. I needed to help you realize this first. Anytime I'm looking at a scale to see what it does, I'm going to label it this way: 1, 9, 3, 11, 5, 13, 7, 8 again.
Okay.
Now you understand that the upper extensions of the chord, like the 9, 11, and 13, are really 2, 4, and 6 in the scale. But in a chord, you can have a chord run through two octaves. But you can't have a scale go through two octaves. It has to fit in one.
Yeah.
So we got to bring those upper extensions of the chord down into the scale, and therefore the 2 is the same as 9, and the 4 is the same as 11, and the 6 is the same as the 13. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
And
That
so
does make
that's how I would always label a scale. So let's say that you're looking at a major scale, and you say, okay, C is 1, D is 9. That's the ninth on the C chord. Then the 3 is E. The F is the 11. Oh, you know what? That doesn't work. It's got to be a sharp 11. Not going to work. Do you know about the fourth note of the scale problem?
what?
The fourth note of the scale, the problem with the fourth note of the scale.
I, I've I've heard it has a lot of tension somewhere with something. It clashes with something.
It has more tension than we can use.
No.
It has a ridiculous amount of. It doesn't work. Again, I'm going to have to let you hear this. This is important that you understand the 11 doesn't work. uh, all right, major chord, all the notes on the scale. I'm going to re-attack the chord each time so you can hear it so it's not dying out and you can't hear it.
Yeah.
That's the 11.
Yeah.
That's the fourth note of the scale.
Okay.
I skipped it at first. Everything else works.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm good.
No. That
Right.
doesn't.
Very different.
And the same if it's dominant. minor. Ooh, it's a pretty note. Half diminished. Still a pretty note.
Yeah.
So the way you have to realize this is if you have a major third in the chord, you may not use the fourth.
Okay.
If you have a minor third in the chord, the fourth can be nice. But not in a dominant or a major chord where you have a major third. And I don't know why it is, but that's the favorite note of a lot of high school improvisers. I've judged a lot of things and it's like... It's like, no, get off that, no. I even had one high school student, Provo High School. This is years ago, but I explained that to him one day in a lesson. He came back the next week and he said, hey, you know that fourth note of the scale thing? I said, yeah. He said, I've been playing around with that at the piano. I said, I think I like it. I said, Tim, you are not allowed to like that. It does not work. And see, this is the very thing that gives us, I should have done this while I was at the piano, but this is the very thing that gives us the movement in the 2-5-1 for the guide tones. Now, did we use that term yet, guide tones?
I've heard it before. I don't know that we have it.
I don't think we did. Well, think about the guide tones. Okay, let's say we're trying to play changes, and I say, okay, you're playing C major, now you're playing C minor. What are your options for making me hear the change that I've changed from major to minor? What options do you have as an improviser?
Flat third, flat 6, flat 7.
So make the E move to the E flat,
Yeah.
or make the B move to the B flat. You're going to hear really clearly that I went from the major to the minor chord.
Yeah.
That's what we call playing changes, right? We play what changes. When the chord changes, do we play the notes that have to change? And when we say the notes that have to change, we mean the notes that have to change by a half step. It's the half steps that make the world go around. Whole steps don't do that. So when we're playing chords, we want to reflect the sound of those chords, then we're always looking for where are my half step movements. Those half step movements are what we call the guide tones.
Half step movements from one chord to the next chord. It changes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
That's what's called the guide tone. Okay.
Yeah. And that's why we call it changes. Now, you've heard that term used in a more generic sense, like, hey, do you know the changes of this tune? That means, do you know what the chord progression is, you know? Can you play the changes? Yeah, I know those chords. No, it's something way more specific than that. Do you play the note that changes when the chord changes?
Yeah. And that it doesn't matter which direction that half step is. It can go up, it can go down. I mean, because he's going from major, right?
Right. Almost always it goes down, but it could go the other way on certain kinds of things. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
So if you think that through on a 2-5, think about this for a second. D minor to G7 to C. What key is the D minor functioning in?
Let's see.
No sharps or flats. What key is the G7 functioning in?
Let's see.
No sharps or flats. And C, of course, is functioning no sharps or flats. Oh, they're all no sharps or flats. Wait a minute. How do you play changes on a 2-5-1? Nothing changes. You say, well, okay, D Dorian scale. How is a D Dorian scale different from a G Mixolydian scale? Well, let's see. D Dorian is no sharps or flats. G Mixolydian is no sharps or flats. C major, no sharps. Wait a minute. There's no difference between a D Dorian and a G Mixolydian scale. Only what note you start on. But there's no actual differences here. There's nothing we can play that says, I went from the 2 chord to the 5 chord. Or I went from the 5 chord to the 1 chord. Or is there? And see, here's where this really becomes important to understand the fourth note of the scale problem. Because there is something that has to change, thankfully. Saves us. But think about every chord that goes with D Dorian And does it work on G7? Say, okay, D on G, that's the fifth. E on G, that's the 13th. F, that's the flat 7. G, that's the root. A, oh, that's the ninth. Good note. B, oh, that's the third. C, fourth note of the scale. No, it has to go down a half step. The C has to go down to B. It cannot stay on C.
Okay, and now becomes the third.
Exactly. So the 7, after you've thought that through, then you can codify it into a principle that, hey, from a 2 to the 5, the flat 7 has to go to 3.
Yeah.
And that's going to be down a half step.
Okay.
Now, if you do the same thinking from the G7 to the C major, you're going to get the same answer. All the notes work until you get to the F. And the F works great on G7, but on C major, no way.
Yeah.
Got to go down a half step to the E. Therefore, again, 7 to the 3. So the guide tones for a 2-5-1 in major are 7 to 3 and 7 to 3. So if I do this, you can hear that I played a chord progression there. It doesn't just sound like I played all. It doesn't sound like this. It doesn't sound like I'm just playing all the same scale.
Right.
Instead, you got. Sounds like a 2-5-1.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because those notes are what say that. See, so. And so it becomes like these are the dots, C to B, F to E. Okay, now it's a dot-to-dot puzzle. How many lines can you draw through those dots and still hit all the dots?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I just drew about 3 or 4 different ways through it. Try another one. Okay, that's a little bit more disguised, but it's still all in there. As I had this. Was in there. It's a little more disguised. But you're actually going to hear the chord progression coming out of that.
Because you're defining it. Yeah.
Yeah. And ultimately, see, this is the acid test of whether a person can play changes. Can I hear the tune with no reference to the melody and no backing track? Can I still tell you're playing that tune? I don't, is there a tune you know pretty well?
I don't know that I can say that.
Yeah.
I wish.
I don't know. Is Autumn Leaves a familiar tune?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Autumn Leaves. I mean, I haven't
Right,
played
see.
it, but I've heard it.
I went one time through it. Now, if you know the tune very well, you can tell I'm playing Autumn Leaves.
Yeah. Okay.
But you may not be able to tell yet.
No, I mean, there's moments I'm like, okay, that sounds like some of the same colors that I connect with Autumn Leaves.
But see, if you've played it at all, if you've worked on it as a tune, you know the tune, then you're going to hear. Just that's the first half of it.
Right. Okay.
So. You're hearing the chords a little bit better. I kind of outlined them a little bit so you
Uh-huh.
could
Yeah.
hear
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I feel like I'm hearing it a little bit. Yep.
Yeah, okay. That's a lot to expect from you right now. But if you've
Yeah.
worked on the tune at all, I mean, I've had experiences with that. Like I was playing Just Friends, a tune called Just Friends in my office. I hadn't had the backing track on for over an hour. I did have it on at first, but I hadn't played the melody for over an hour. When the next student came for his lesson, I'd been practicing Just Friends that whole hour. The student knocked on the door and I just yelled, "Come in." They came in and went over to the other end of the room, started taking their instrument out of the case, and I just kept playing. And after a second, the student said, "Just Friends?"
Yeah.
He could tell it was Just Friends because he knew the tune. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. And then so when you stopped and you said, um, if you're familiar with the tune, this is what you're going to hear. And then were you playing the guide tones? Is that what you would then
Yeah.
play
Yeah. I played the
from chord
guide.
to chord? And
Uh,
then and then and then you started kind of outlining. I guess drawing the dot to dot is what.
yeah. I outlined the chords about pretty fairly clearly, but around the guide tones still.
Yeah. Okay.
And then finally, I just played a little more freely around the guide tones, and not sometimes scale wise, and not just always chord tones. But,
Uh, yeah,
but
that
if you
makes
play
sense.
the chord tones. Now you can kind of hear 2-5-1 in major, 2-5-1 in minor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And so when you're doing that, when you're improvising over a tune, are you always trying to outline every chord or define every chord in what you're improvising, or?
The bebop way would be to play the changes so that you hear all the chords.
Mhm.
Sometimes you skip one or you don't do every one of them, but by and large, and if with a student, yeah, I'd be saying get every one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
work it through. Now that fourth note of the scale thing then is what saves us there because it's the fourth that has to move down by a half step, even though we're all in the same key.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And in the minor key, think about this. And this is all outlined in the book. If you read through carefully through chapter 20, it'll make more sense now.
Mhm.
21. Okay, so the 7 to the 3 still works when I'm going from half diminished to altered dominant. So in the minor 2-5, the 2 to the 5, 7 to 3 is still the right thing to do. But now what happens if I go from the 7 to the 3, from the dominant to the minor chord, the 1 chord? Now the flat 7, which usually goes down to 3, is going down to flat 3.
That's a whole step.
Dang, that's a whole step. Not going to really define. Will it sound bad? No, it'll sound fine. But it's not going to really define the chord progression. So I have to say, well, what else have I got? And see, if I don't alter, I don't have anything else. But if I alter, I got some other possibilities.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Like what? Well, let's say I'm going. There's a half step. I went from the flat 9 down to the 5. Or here's another half step. Now I went from the sharp 5 to the 9. Really pretty, actually.
Yeah.
I could
Cool.
even do this. Oh, sorry. I resolved that wrong. So it doesn't get used as much. It's a little harder to make it work. But I was going from the sharp 9 up to the major 7 on the 1 chord, which is like a half step.
Okay. Yeah.
So I actually outlined this in the book that there are several more. If you alter, you have several more different half steps that you could use as guide tones.
So that's one of the big reasons we alter it when we're in minor. That's why we
One
alter
of the
it.
reasons that we alter a lot in major too is just because it gives us more possibilities, more options for
Yeah.
what those guide tones are.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
Now, see, if you're talking to a classical musician about how the five weren't going to the one, you say, well, okay, how many notes do you have that need to move when you go from G7 to C major? In other words, tendency tones that need to resolve
Yeah.
from the G7 to the C major. What tones do you have?
So they would talk about the B to the C. And,
Yeah, and the F to the E. The tritone has to contract.
right,
Yeah, that B to C. But see, we're saying, wait a minute, we don't want to play C. We want to play B. We want the major seven.
all right.
We don't want it to go to the root. In fact, the root sounds pretty pedestrian. Sounds pretty plain and almost dumb when you play the root on the major chord. You want that pretty color of the seven or the nine or other pretty notes. But so that B to C isn't really something that we care about in the jazz world. The F to the E then is the only one we actually have
Yeah.
because the B is going to stay a B.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
That makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's all fairly outlined in the book. Now that I've kind of opened your mind to it, I think you'll be able to kind of understand what I was doing with that in the book, probably.
Yeah. I'll definitely go through that and review it again. So that'll be good.
I kind of got diverted talking about the fourth note of the scale and then into guide tones. We needed to do that, but I want to go back to where we started, scales. Yeah. So I take a C major scale, C major, D Dorian, E Phrygian, F Lydian. Okay, so every classical book does this. Your Urban's book would do that. You go each mode, you start on every scale degree of each scale, and you play all the modes, but you never think of it consciously as what it is. I mean, I just named it as a mode. You're saying, well, that's just starting on the first degree, and then the second degree, and then the third degree, and then the fourth. Exactly. That's what your modes are.
Right. Yeah.
But it doesn't really get you thinking as what the Dorian mode is as an entity of its own, instead of it's the second degree of that scale. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a good idea to practice it. And we did this last time, going around the circle, practicing the Dorian modes. So they can conceive them as their own self,
Yeah. That makes
And
sense.
then I think we did this where we went. So we went 2-5-1s around the circle, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a good way to start thinking of Dorian and Mixolydian as their own entities. The major, of course, we start there. We got to have that one first. We're already thinking about that as its own entity. Now we got to think of the Dorian and Mixolydian not just as other modes, but as their own self. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. That does make sense.
We kind of have to put it in a way that makes sense to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones we need the most. You don't hear people do this all the time, but then later you say, well, I need to know my Lydian modes. So. Yeah, I can actually go around the circle and just play all my Lydian modes, so I can see if that's Lydian, that's Lydian, you know what I mean? And I think we talked quite a bit last time about thinking parallel versus relative. See, with the Lydian, I would not think relative. Down a fourth is a lot harder than just raise the fourth.
Yeah.
Just raise the fourth, you got Lydian. And so anyway, I would want to learn all those modes of the major scale, but as entities as opposed to just families.
Right.
Yeah. Now I'm going to take the melodic minor. I'm going to change one note. Okay, so there's the home mode. That works great with a minor chord that has a major 7, which is going to be a chord functioning as a tonic in a minor key, right?
Yeah.
So we use that a lot. All right, now let's say I play it on E flat. That's the third mode of the same scale. Say, oh, okay, that's 1, 9, 3. Oh, it's a major 3. A is sharp 4, B is sharp 5. And then it has C, it's regular 6 for 13. D, oh, it's a major 7. Oh, this is this is going to fit a major chord because it has a major 3rd and a major 7. But it handles the sharp 4 and the sharp 5.
Right.
Well, this doesn't happen very often. But we call it Lydian augmented.
Okay.
The Lydian part is the sharp 4, and the augmented part is the sharp 5.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Lydian augmented is the name of that mode. It actually, if you think about what can happen to a major chord, not very many things, and it's still major. I mean, say major chord, okay, flat to 3, oh, not major anymore. Oh, flat to 7, not major anymore. Sharp to 5, oh, yeah, we could do that. It's still major. Sharp to 4, the 11, yeah, it's still major. So really, that's it. Major, major sharp 11, major sharp 5.
Yeah.
So the major scale takes care of major. The Lydian scale takes care of major sharp 11. The Lydian augmented scale takes care of major sharp 5. And so we've got everything that can happen in major covered between those two families of scales. Now I'm going to go to the fourth mode. I'm going to label it 1, 9, 3 is major, 4 is sharp, sharp 4, 5, 6, or 13, flat 7. Oh, has a major 3rd and a flat 7. That's going to be a dominant application. That's going to go with dominant. But it has a sharp 11. Oh, hey, this fits dominant with a sharp 11. So we call this fourth mode a Lydian dominant scale because it has a sharp 4, that's the Lydian effect, and it has a flat 7, that's the dominant effect. So this is a Lydian dominant. The fourth mode is Lydian dominant. That's going to cover anytime you have a dominant with a sharp 11. Okay, then I go to the fifth mode. This is not ridiculous like the second mode that's totally unusable. This is a possible use, but we have a scale that does a better job for this reason. And what does it do? Has a major 3rd and a flat 7, so it's dominant. And then it has a sharp 5 or a 13. Well, it has a regular 5 in it too, so I guess it's a flat 13. I don't know. It's just not. We don't need it. So I never worry about the fifth mode either. Then the sixth mode. Okay, this is interesting. On A, B, oh, has a major 9. C is flat 3. D is regular 11. Flat 5, E flat. F, oh, flat 6. Flat 7. Oh, this looks a lot like half diminished. It's got flat 3, flat 5, flat 7 as chord tones. It looks like a Locrian scale, except for that one note. If it was a Locrian scale, it would have B flat. It would be the 7th mode of B flat major. But it looks like a Locrian scale that has a B natural. That's that Locrian sharp 2 scale that we saw in the book a while ago. What's it for? What's it for? It covers the other possibility in half diminished. Half diminished can have a regular flat 9 on it, or it can have a major 9. So if it has a flat 9, Locrian. If it has a major 9, then we need the Locrian sharp 2, which the sharp 2 is actually the 9. It's a major 9. So it will cover, between those two families, we're covering everything that can happen in half diminished.
Yeah, okay.
You know what? I didn't do that for minor a minute ago. But what happens in minor? Well, usually Dorian. If it's functioning as a 6, Aeolian, natural minor. If it's functioning as a 3, Phrygian. Okay, so that covers everything that usually happens to a minor chord. Whoa, wait a minute. What if it's a 1? Well, then the first mode of that second scale set. So I've got my first scale set is all the scales derived from the major scale. Then I changed one note, and now I'm revisiting all the scales derived from melodic minor. And there's a lot of useful ones, as you're saying.
Mhm.
And so we can actually cover between the first set of scales and the second set of scales, and there's only one note difference between the second set of scales. We can cover everything that happens in major, everything that happens in minor, everything that happens in half diminished. And so far we've covered dominant with a sharp 11. And then last week we talked about the 7th mode of this scale, which is where we're at now. We got the 6th mode is Locrian sharp 2. Now we got the 7th mode. Now if I label that scale, I got 1, flat 9, sharp 9, major third, flat 5, sharp 5, flat 7. Oh, it has a major third and flat 7. It's going to cover dominant stuff. But it has a flat and a sharp 9, and it has a flat and a sharp 5, so it'll cover any kind of combinations of flat 5s and sharp 5s. And that's our 7th mode there, the one we've been calling super Locrian. Right?
Yeah.
So that covers a lot of stuff that happens in dominant. But dominant's very flexible. It can have a lot of things happen to it. We haven't covered what happens if it has a sharp 5. We haven't covered what happens if it has just a flat 9. And this is where we have to get into the 3rd scale family, which is what I'm going to call the symmetrical scales.
Okay.
Now, I think you've probably been exposed to all the symmetrical scales. Messiaen would have called them the scales of limited transposition because they don't have 12 different transpositions. What are we talking about? Chromatic scale is our most symmetrical scale. I mean, it doesn't matter where you stop or start. It's one scale. That's it. There's only one of them, right? Whole tone. Okay, how many whole tones are there?
2.
2. Yeah, because no matter what scale degree you start on in the Locrian in the whole tone scale, it's the same scale, and you just have to go up a half step and get the other 6 scales. So Locrian whole tone is our second symmetrical scale, and then we have a third symmetrical scale that we call diminished. In classical theory, they tend to call it octatonic, not diminished. Were you exposed to the octatonic scale?
Yeah, that's the whole step, half step, whole step, half step.
Yeah. And typically, classically, we call that octatonic, and we call it whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. In jazz, we call this the diminished scale.
Okay.
And the one we use the most goes half whole, half whole, half whole, not whole, half, whole, half. Half whole, half whole. What does this cover? Well, the whole tone covers dominant 7, sharp 5. How do we know? Let's label the notes in the whole tone scale. If you're looking at C, then 1. D is 9. Oh, doesn't cover any alterations of the ninth. The D is just natural. E, okay, has a major third. F sharp and G sharp, oh, has the sharp 11, or it has the flat 5, and it has the sharp 5. And then it has a flat 7. Oh, major third, flat 7. It's going to cover dominant, but it also covers sharp 5 and flat 5. In other words, the whole tone covers any kind of alterations of fifths. And then you look at the diminished. If we label the diminished, since we're going half step first, it'll go C, D flat, E natural, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C. And you say, okay, 1, flat 9, sharp 9. The 4th note of the scale turns out to be the major third. That happened on the super Locrian too. So don't let that alarm you. It's just that we have 2 second degrees, the sharp 9 and the flat 9. Okay, so the diminished scale goes 1, flat 9, sharp 9, 3. It does have a sharp 11 in it, or a flat 5, and then it has not a sharp 5. It has just a regular 5. Regular 13 has a flat 7. So it has a major third and a flat 7. It's going to be a dominant application, and it's going to cover the flat 9 chord. Now, can it cover a sharp 9 chord? Yes, but in jazz, here's an unwritten principle. The sharp 9 always includes the sharp 5. It always implies sharp 5. If you see a dominant 7 sharp 9 chord, you're going to put the sharp 5 in it. The piano player is going to voice sharp 5 in it. Guitar player is going to voice sharp 5 in it. Soloist has to realize it's going to be sharp 5. Therefore, the diminished scale, which does not have a sharp 5, doesn't really cover that.
Yeah.
But what it does cover is flat 9, which does not imply the sharp 5. And so therefore it covers the flat 9 sound really well.
Okay.
So now I try to always specialize in, okay, how do you learn this stuff in an easy way? And so far, by thinking either parallel or relative, we can learn everything in a really easy way. But now with the symmetrical scales, we don't have that crutch. We don't have that option.
Yeah.
Right? So with whole tone, I think of the whole tone as 2 scales. Okay, the one on C, it's an interesting scale, has F sharp, G sharp, and B flat. Everything else is natural. And the one on C sharp, that's the easy one. I think of that, it has 2 sharps, C sharp and D sharp. I'm starting on F. Played C sharp and D sharp, and I've got whole tone. So that's kind of how I usually approach whole tone. But how do you approach diminished? All right, this is me in high school. Let's see, diminished. Half step. Whole step. Let's see, half step. Crap, where was I? Half step. Whole step. Yeah, half step. I mean, it's going to be the millennium before I get any fluency with this scale at that rate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how I was trying to learn it when I was first in high school, was intervallically like that, where I'm thinking half step, whole step, half step, whole step. That's the worst way to learn it. Let me show you a really slick way to learn this. And really, you probably need to do this on the... Why don't you do that on the saxophone?
Yeah.
So let's do the one that's on C.
Okay.
And we're going to learn it descending. So I'm going to go down like I'm in C7.
Okay.
So think about a C mixed Lydian scale, just as a flat 7.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to put the tritone sub right inside the scale. Now I'm going to do F sharp dominant 7. And then I'm going to connect back. Yeah. Yeah, then we connect back to C. So this scale is actually, if we were to define this in ridiculous pedantic terms, it's the upper tetrachord of 2 mixed Lydian scales juxtaposed by a tritone.
That sounds like a great thing to say, too.
So I use this with the kids. I'll do this. This is making the connection. It's C dominant and making the connection to the F sharp.
Okay, yeah.
So try that. Good. Yeah. And then I'm doing the F sharp and connecting back to the C.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Then you could do, and I usually do like 4 repetitions of each one, back and forth several times. and then maybe 2 repetitions. Why don't you try that? You don't have to go as fast as I'm going. You're missing it. I think you're missing the D sharp. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And then let's repeat again the top octave, the top part, and then this bottom part. Yeah. So now. And then I just do that a bunch of times down like that. Finally, you say, let's see if the momentum will take me back up. Don't go that fast, but just try that. See what happens. Pretty good. Yeah. And look, you're already playing half step, pole step, half step, pole step, half step, pole step without having to think in the intervals. Automatically getting that for what you're doing.
Yeah, I've tried to do some diminished scale practice before, and I look exactly like you did. You know, I get halfway up the scale and I'm like, wait, which one am I on?
Right. So this is a slick way to learn your diminished scales. Now you understand that we just did 4 different diminished scales all at once, right?
Because it's symmetrical. Yeah.
Because every time you go a half step and a whole step, you're starting over.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, this is a bonus scale. You get 4 for the price of 1.
Yeah.
So we've got the one on C. We also have it on E flat. We also have it on F sharp and A. Those are all exactly the same notes and the same fingerings. All of them, all 4 of them.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. That's cool. I'm just trying to find a way to like help myself remember this, you know, write a couple things down so I look at it. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I remember what we did.
Sure, write down what you need to.
Cool. Yeah.
So you really don't have to know the one on C, the one on C sharp, the one on D. You know all 12 of them. So then I'd go to the next one. Now C sharp on the top and G dominant on the bottom. C sharp dominant on the top, G dominant on the bottom. And that's going to give me C sharp, E, G, and B flat. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to go to D. D7 on the top, A flat 7 on the bottom.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. That's going to give me D, F, A flat, and B. Right?
Yeah, yep.
So I just need those 3, and that's going to give me all my diminished scales. That's how I would teach it.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then I would go around the circle, and it would make me juxtapose. So I'm going to go. There's one on C. Now I'm on F. That's one on D. Now I'm on B flat. I did something weird there. I don't know what, but anyway, that's the one on C sharp. Then I'm on E flat. Oh, that's the one on C again. Now I'm on A flat. That's the one on D again. Now I'm on C sharp. That's the one on C sharp. It's going to make it keep juxtaposing the 3 of them back and forth, see? to
Yeah.
around the circle. That helps you get to know them even better.
Cool.
Those are good to know. They color the flat nine, dominant seven, flat nine really well. You know
Mhm.
what else they do is they cover the diminished seven chord, not half diminished, but the fully diminished seven chord.
Okay.
But we learned it with the half step. Now, see, learning it with the whole step, I don't have a slick way for that.
Okay.
Learning it with a half step, we got a slick way to do that. We can get it happening. It's going to be great. What do I have to do to play it with a whole step now? And with the at diminished seven, I need to play it with the whole step first. With the dominant seven flat nine, half step first. Diminished seven, whole step first. Well, if I know all three of the scales with half diminished, with half step first, then what if I have to play a C scale with a whole step first? Well, I start on C and I go up a whole step to D, and then I play the one with D on D with a half step first.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see what I mean? I mean,
It's
it's,
what I already know.
so in other words, once you know it with a half step, it's a piece of cake to get him with the whole step.
Yeah. You're just starting slightly.
I mean, it's almost like the difference between playing C major and D Dorian at that point.
Right. Yeah. They're right next to each other.
Yeah. So it is good to know them both ways. But dominant seven flat nine happens a whole lot more in jazz than diminished seventh does.
Yeah.
Since we got a slick way of learning it, I would learn it first. I would learn it first with a half step. I'm going to apply it more often with a half step. But then I would want to also know it later with a whole step. And then when I need it on the diminished seven, I've got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to bring that together, I don't know if you understand this, but a dominant seven with a flat nine and the diminished seven chord are the same chord actually. Think about this. What if you have C sharp, E, G, B flat? Okay, that's a diminished C sharp diminished seven chord, right? C sharp, E, G, B flat.
Yeah.
Okay, now start on A. A, C sharp, E, G, B flat. Oh, now it's A7 flat 9.
Okay. Yeah.
In other words, the diminished 7 chord is contained within a dominant 7 flat 9 chord.
Right.
And another way to realize this is that the diminished 7 chord does not have a real root. It's a totally ambiguous chord. It only because any note in the chord could act as a root.
Okay.
Right? The C, the E flat, the F sharp, and the A, they all act as a root. It doesn't have a real. It's a kind of a. In fact, I don't know if they do this at BYU. Probably not. But when I was at Indiana University and we were doing figured bass, if we had a diminished 7 chord, we had to write it with a Roman numeral 5, a little diminished circle 9. That's what we did for figured bass. What that meant was it was an incomplete dominant 5/9 chord. Incomplete in what way? The root's missing.
Yeah.
So where's the root? It's down a major third from what looks like the real root. The real root is down a major third from what looks like the root. So now what's interesting is if I do an A diminished scale for the dominant 7 flat 9. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm playing super Locrian. Okay, that works great because A, B flat, there's my flat 9. C, there's my sharp 9. C sharp, there's my major third. See, that's fitting, that's painting that just perfectly. But now look, I just got this. Just got to C sharp. Okay, this is where my diminished 7 chord starts. What's my next interval on the scale right there? Whole step. Does it make sense that the A7 flat 9 and the C sharp diminished 7 chord should use the same scale? They're basically the same chord. They use the same scale.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
But if you start on A, it starts with a half step. The same exact scale and the same exact notes. By the time you get to C sharp, it's a whole step.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, C sharp diminished needs the whole step first.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why that all comes about that way.
Fascinating.
Does this make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's like it does make sense. I'm trying to think, if I tried to repeat it to somebody else, would I be able to explain it?
Yeah.
Eventually, I think I need to practice it, but it makes sense. It makes sense.
I think that's all in the book,
Mhm.
but it makes a lot more sense if we've talked about it first. And I think you'll be able to understand it. So if you need a review, I think you'll find it's there.
Okay, good.
At least I think it is. I can't remember doing that. I
Yeah,
think it's.
I'm definitely going to be going through this chapter, so I'll see what
So chapter 20 and 21 is where, well, 20 is where all this theory is, I think. 21 is application to blues and rhythm changes and stuff. Now, my fourth category of scales are the miscellaneous scales that don't really fit anything else, like the blues scale and the pentatonic scales, the major and the minor pentatonic scales. I make that category 4. But by the time you've learned the derivatives of the major scale, the derivatives of the major scale with a flat 3, the symmetrical scales, and then those 3 odd miscellaneous scales, you've actually learned everything you'd ever need to know to cover anything that'll ever happen. However, there are other interesting scales you can mess around with that you could put in that miscellaneous category, but you don't really have to have them. Things like Hindu minor or Gypsy minor or crazy things. You don't,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
that would actually cover everything. The one thing that we've left out that I need to add to it, though, I would put it in the major derivative family. It's actually a variant of the Lydian scale. And it's something that we call the Bebop Scale.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if you've ever heard of the Bebop
I've
Scale.
heard of it. Um, is it? I'm trying to remember what it is. It has like a 7 and a flat 7, right? Or something
Yes,
like that.
yes. All we do is add one additional note to the Lydian scale, and we have a Bebop Scale.
Yeah.
But why? Let me show you this. I'm not going to add the note. I'm just going to do Lydian. What notes are ending up in the strong positions? In other words, the downbeats. All right, so G, okay, that's fine. E, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a pretty nondescript note. It's not a very definitional note for a G7.
Right.
Then D, C is in the strong position. That's my 4th note of the scale. That's a bad idea. And then A, okay, the 9th's okay in the strong. But see, none of the target notes are in the strong position.
Right.
Target notes meaning the chord tones, the definitional notes of this chord. All right, so now what if I put that one extra note? Puts all the chord tones in the strong positions.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. Plus, how many notes do I have if I do this? I'm one note short. If I put one more note in there, I come out
Yeah.
rhythmically.
Right. Right.
The other way, I'm one note short rhythmically.
Okay.
So the bebop scale actually helps me put the right notes in the strong positions and gives me the ability to fill up rhythms the best way. Therefore, it's a very useful scale to know, very useful scale to teach.
Okay.
And it's
And so is
easy,
it? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
easy to teach it in a band warm up and stuff too. Go ahead.
Yeah. So is it usually only played in that descending format that you just did? Is it used any other way
Yes.
or?
The bebop scale is only descending.
Okay.
How do you ascend on a bebop scale?
Play maybe.
You actually ascend up a chord. It goes like this. I'm back at the top.
Okay.
And what did I do? I went to the flat 7 and then I ascended up the major chord, built on the flat 7. So I went down G dominant. Well, I went down G bebop. I added the F sharp and the F natural. And then at the bottom, I did it again, F sharp, F natural. And then from the F natural, I went F, A, C, E, G, and I'm back at the top. It's an F major 9 chord.
Cool. Sounds great. Yeah.
Now, there's a ton of stuff that grows out of the bebop scale that's really valuable. I mean, that in itself right there is valuable. But there's a whole lot more that grows out of this. How do I get more variety out of this scale? Well, first thing I could do is go up before I go down. I went up 1 note. I'm going to go up 2. I'm going to go up 3. So I get variety by going up before I go down sometimes. I get variety by going back up. So now I'm going to start low and go up. Then I went up before I went down. After I got to the top, I went up some more before I went down.
Yeah.
The other thing that brings a lot of value to this is to do what we call enclosures. Now, an enclosure is when you play a half step above, half step below to hit your target note. Mm-hmm. So let's say this is my target note. So I go, that's called an enclosure to that target note. I played a half step above it, then a half step below it. Try that. Just play a G and then play A flat, F sharp. Okay, that would be an enclosure. Now, if I did that and then I went down the bebop scale, I did the enclosure again at the bottom.
Are you starting on the G or on the G sharp?
Starting on the A flat, F sharp, G, on the bebop scale.
Okay.
Yeah, you could do it. You could do it again or not.
Okay, yeah.
You know, either way, yeah. That would be an enclosure to the root of that G bebop scale. Now, what if I want to do an enclosure to the 5th? I'm a half step above, half step below, then I hit the D.
Okay, so.
That's it. And then you always go down. You want the bebop thing to come out of that. Go down a little more because it's cool if it happens in both octaves.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So I could even put those two together. I put the enclosure of the root and the enclosure of the 5th. Yeah. To be honest with you, I don't use those very much. The ones that I use a lot are the enclosure for the 3rd. Okay. So here would be an enclosure for the 3rd. Now I enclosed it by coming 2 half steps underneath it, because if I enclose it by playing the half step above it, that's the 4th note of the scale in a strong position. Disqualified. No. So I'm skipping from the 4 down to the 2, coming chromatically back up.
Okay.
So skip from the C down to the A, then A sharp, B, and you chromatically come up to the 3rd.
Oh, okay. So you're not playing the half step above the 3rd, but it's still called an enclosure of the 3rd.
Right.
Yeah. Let me try it.
And go down to A. Skip down. That's it. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Let me try that.
And it's no, in reality, the C is acting as part of the enclosure. You got a half step above and then two half steps below. An enclosure doesn't always have to be a half step above and half step below. It could be two half steps above and two half steps below. It could be a whole step above and two half steps below. It could be a half step above and one half and two half steps below. It could be any combination.
Okay. Yeah. And so that idea of an enclosure is that specific to the bebop scale?
Yes. Well,
Or
we
it's
practice them in the bebop scale, but they happen all over the place. I mean, this is a Charlie Parker thing. It's in a tune called Yardbird Suite, and he's going. Let's see. Well, he's got two enclosures in there. There's the enclosure to the third, and then he goes half step above and two half steps below to the fifth of the next chord.
okay.
And it's not locked into the bebop scale at all. See?
Right. Yeah.
But we practice this stuff in the bebop scale so that gets into our ears and it gets into our fingers, and then it starts to show up all over the place
That makes sense.
when it's supposed to, when it
Yeah.
should. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the enclosure that I just did is based on the ascending. What if I do this? But instead of going all the way up, just try that. We're going bebop scale down to the 7, then we're going up the chord, but we're only going to the 7. Goes like that.
Right. So
Maybe you're going to F major. You're going up F major, so your next note's E. Then let it drop down to D.
okay.
Now, once I get to the D, I'm going to do a chromatic. I'm going to do a diatonic enclosure to the third. So I'm above it, I'm below it, I'm less above it, and below it, and then I nail it. It's like a funnel to the target note. Yeah, it's got a lot of energy. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just trying to make sure I follow on it. Yeah.
So now you're on the fifth, skip down to 2, so you're below the third. Then go to this 4, then go to the 4, and then back to the 2, and then the 3. So it goes 5 2 4 2 3.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Now that's a double enclosure. Diatonically,
Yeah. Okay.
it's a double enclosure to the third.
Mhm.
As soon as you hit the third, you keep going down the scale.
Yeah. Cool.
By the way, this is a lot of heavy stuff today. I'm really burying you today.
Yeah.
Hopefully not overwhelming you, but but
I'm just hoping some of it will stick. I love it though. It's so fun.
but you know these things are recorded, and if you'd like me, if you remind me, I can send you a recording of this, and you can refer to it back if you need to.
Oh yeah. That's a good idea.
So that's an enclosure for the third. I use it a lot.
Mhm.
What if I played the first 3 notes up an octave? I played exactly all the same pitches. I just put the first 3 notes up an octave instead of. All I did is that. Same pitches. So there's an enclosure for the third. Here's another one that's a little more chromatic. So now it's a little. Now I kind of have to do this little squirrely thing at the top to have it come out rhythmically right, but sharp 4, 2, 4, and could be sharp 2. So that's more chromatic.
Uh-huh.
Even more funnelish.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's times when I'll use both of them in 2 different octaves. It'd be like, let me put it in a different key so I have more range. I did one enclosure up here, the other enclosure down here.
Yeah. Okay.
They're both enclosures to the third. I actually wrote all this in the book. If you find the part in the book about the bebop scale, all this stuff is written in there with numbers.
Okay, good.
So you can sit there and play around with it.
Okay. Yeah, that's good because I'm like,
I think the really big value
oh yeah.
is having these all these variants to the bebop scale. That's what gives you the bebop chromaticism in your fingers, in your ears.